Imagine a mystery as old as time itself, an enigma that has spanned millennia and still echoes in the minds of those seeking to understand humanity's greatest secrets. What if I told you that the 12 tribes of Israel, pillars of biblical history, hid a profound secret? A secret involving the dispersion of 10 of these tribes, lost in the sands of time but now beginning to emerge, carrying the promise of a prophetic fulfillment that could shape the destiny of humanity. These tribes, chosen by God for a sacred purpose, experienced moments of glory under the leadership of kings like David and Solomon. But after a period of disobedience and rebellion, their unity fell apart, and the 10 northern tribes disappeared, scattered to the four corners of the earth. What happened to them? Could they still be among us, hidden within ancient cultures and traditions, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves? In today's video, we'll dive deep into the origins of the 12 tribes of Israel and follow the thread that leads us to their most profound stories. We'll explore oral traditions, historical records, and biblical prophecies to unravel the mystery of the lost tribes. But we won't stop there. We'll go further, connecting these fragments of history to our present day and examining how these events shape the prophetic narratives of the end times. It all begins with Jacob, Abraham's grandson, a man whose destiny was forever changed after a supernatural encounter. Jacob wrestled with God and was given a new name, Israel, one who struggles with God. His 12 sons became the patriarchs of the 12 tribes, each destined to inherit a portion of the promised land. These patriarchs formed the backbone of the nation of Israel, but their stories are as complex as the prophecies they carry. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, whose inheritance was divided between his sons Ephraim and Manasseh, and Benjamin, names that echo through the centuries, filled with meaning and promise. Yet, as Scripture tells us, their unity did not last. After Solomon's reign, the kingdom split. The south, known as Judah, remained under the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. The north, led by tribes like Ephraim and Manasseh, fell into idolatry and disobedience. God sent prophets like Hosea and Amos to warn them, but the northern tribes ignored these warnings. In 7722 BCE, divine judgment came in the form of the Assyrian Empire. The north was invaded, its lands plundered, and the 10 tribes were scattered to foreign territories, absorbed into surrounding cultures until they disappeared from the historical record. But did they truly disappear? Or were their stories simply buried, waiting to be rediscovered? Groups across the world, from Ethiopia to India, throughout Asia, and even the Americas, claim descent from these lost tribes. Their cultural traditions and religious practices contain striking echoes of ancient Israelite laws and customs. Some believe these tribes still have a crucial role to play in fulfilling end times prophecies. In this first chapter of our journey, we uncover the starting point of this grand narrative, which connects the distant past to the hopes and expectations of the present. Get ready, because with every step forward, surprising revelations and unexpected connections weave history and prophecy together. What lies ahead might change how you see humanity's history and the destiny that awaits us. The Eternal Compass invites you to dive into this mystery. The story is still being written, and you are part of it. As we delve deeper into the intricate ramifications of the history of the tribes of Israel, it is essential to understand how these tribes fragmented and why the fate of 10 of them has been shrouded in mystery for so many centuries. The once united and prosperous kingdom of Israel became a scene of internal tensions and conflicts that culminated in its division after King Solomon's death. This schism was not just political, it was spiritual, deeply rooted in the relationship between God and his chosen people. Solomon, known for his unmatched wisdom and wealth, made a critical mistake that would forever alter Israel's history. Although he built the magnificent temple in Jerusalem, he also succumbed to the influence of his many foreign wives, allowing the introduction of idolatrous practices into Israel. This failure of leadership weakened the people's commitment to the divine covenant, setting the stage for the nation's spiritual decline. After Solomon's death, the kingdom was divided into two. To the south, the kingdom of Judah, formed by the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, retained Jerusalem as its capital and the temple as the center of worship to God. In the north, however, the kingdom of Israel emerged, composed of the other 10 tribes. Under the leadership of Jeroboam, the first king of the north, the divide deepened. Fearing that his people might return to Jerusalem to worship at the temple, Jeroboam built altars in Dan and Bethel, introducing golden calves as objects of worship. This decision marked the beginning of a long series of acts of rebellion against God. The prophets sent to the northern kingdom were voices of warning amid chaos. Men like Hosea and Amos cried out for the people to turn to their covenant with God, but their words often fell on deaf ears. In an act of profound mercy, God gave the people time to repent, but eventually, divine judgment became inevitable. Rampant sin and idolatry had severed the spiritual connection that once united the tribes under God's protection. It was then that the Assyrian Empire, a relentless military power, entered the scene. In 722 BCE, the Assyrians invaded the northern kingdom, destroying cities and capturing much of the population. The tribes were scattered to foreign territories, resettled in distant lands under Assyrian control. This dispersion was not only physical, but also cultural and spiritual. Over time, tribal identities faded, customs blended with local cultures, and the northern tribes became, in the eyes of history, the lost tribes of Israel. However, the disappearance of the 10 tribes is not merely a historical tragedy. It is a central piece in a much larger narrative. The Bible does not treat these tribes as a closed chapter, but as a vital element in events yet to come. Numerous prophecies point to the return of these tribes in the end times, an event that would symbolize not only the restoration of Israel, but the culmination of God's plan for humanity. Biblical texts are rich with imagery of this return. In Ezekiel 37, the prophet envisions a powerful scene, a valley of dry bones that come to life as the Spirit of God breathes upon them. These bones, God explains, represent the whole house of Israel, both the northern and southern tribes. God's promise is clear. I will make them one nation in the land, on the mountains of Israel. There will be one king over all of them, and they will never again be two nations or be divided into two kingdoms. Ezekiel 37, verse 22. This vision is not just a promise of physical restoration, but of a spiritual rebirth that will unite all the tribes under the rule of the Messiah. Another foundational text is found in Isaiah 11, verse 12, where the prophet describes God raising a banner to gather the exiles of Israel and the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. This prophecy points to a glorious future when all the tribes will be reunited, not just as a restored nation, but as God's chosen people, fulfilling their role in His divine plan. But how does this restoration connect to our modern world? This is where the story of the lost tribes becomes even more fascinating. Groups around the globe claim to be descendants of these tribes, and their stories are filled with echoes of ancient Israelite traditions. For example, the Beta Israel, or Ethiopian Jews, maintain practices such as observing the Sabbath and keeping kosher dietary laws, even through centuries of isolation. Their modern-day return to Israel, through operations like Operation Moses and Operation Solomon, has been seen by many as a partial fulfillment of the regathering prophecies. Yet, the Beta Israel are only one piece of the puzzle. The Beni Israel of India, the Pashtuns of Afghanistan and Pakistan, the Igbo of Nigeria, and the Lemba of Zimbabwe and South Africa also claim descent from the lost tribes. Their stories and traditions raise a fascinating question. Were the tribes truly lost, or were they scattered like seeds, waiting for the right moment to germinate and reveal their purpose in God's plan? As we explore these stories, it becomes evident that the dispersion of the tribes was far more than a historical event. It was a strategic part of God's plan, a process that scattered not only people, but also fragments of His covenant and promise to the ends of the earth. And now, as these tribes begin to reappear, the world watches in awe as prophecies that once seemed distant now feel closer than ever. As these stories of dispersion and reunion begin to unfold, we find ourselves faced with questions that go beyond recorded history. How have groups claiming descent from the lost tribes managed to preserve fragments of an identity that should have been erased by the forces of time and cultural assimilation? The case of the Beta Israel, Ethiopian Jews, is just one piece of this intricate mosaic. Their practices and traditions, preserved over centuries, are a living testimony to the resilience of an identity that transcended geography and oppression. And yet they are not alone. In India, we find the Bene Israel, a group whose history is equally intriguing. According to their oral tradition, their ancestors arrived on the western coast of India after a shipwreck. Isolated from larger Jewish communities, they maintained practices such as observing the Sabbath, circumcision, and dietary laws that echo Mosaic laws. How did they preserve these traditions through centuries of isolation? Could this be evidence of God's faithfulness to his promises, ensuring that no trace of his chosen tribes would ever be completely lost? Even more striking is the story of the Pashtuns of Afghanistan and Pakistan. This group, who refer to themselves as Bani Israel, literally children of Israel, preserve traditions that reflect ancient Israelite practices. They perform circumcision on the 8th day, avoid eating pork, and have a tribal structure reminiscent of the organization of the tribes of Israel. Some even bear names that directly link to biblical tribes, such as Levani, which resembles the Levites. How have these traditions survived in a region marked by centuries of conflict and cultural transformations? Their persistence defies purely historical explanations and points to something greater, perhaps a spiritual calling that kept them connected to their Israelite origins. But the connections do not stop there. In West Africa, the Igbo people of Nigeria have a fascinating history. Many Igbo believe they are descendants of the tribes of Gad and Zebulun, basing their claims on cultural practices that echo Jewish traditions. Circumcision on the 8th day, strict dietary laws, and the observance of religious festivals are just a few examples. Additionally, their oral history mentions an ancestry that traces back to a migration from Israel through North Africa before settling in their current location. These claims have sparked growing interest, leading some members of the community to formally reconnect with Judaism in a movement many see as a reflection of the prophecies about the gathering of the lost tribes. Then we arrive at the fascinating case of the Lemba, a group from Zimbabwe and South Africa that claims descent from the tribe of Levi, the priestly lineage of Israel. Their cultural practices include dietary restrictions resembling kosher laws and an unwavering tradition of maintaining circumcision and Sabbath observance. Most striking, however, is the genetic evidence supporting their claims. Many members of the Lemba people carry the Cohen modal haplotype, a genetic marker associated with the descendants of Aaron, the priest. This modern discovery through DNA testing reinforces the idea that the lost tribes are not as lost as we once imagined, but rather dispersed, waiting for a designated moment to reemerge on the stage of history. These stories are more than fascinating narratives of cultural survival. They intertwine with biblical prophecies that speak of the return of the dispersed tribes as a sign of the end times. In Isaiah 11 verse 12, we see the promise that God will raise a banner for the nations and gather the exiles of Israel from the four corners of the earth. This powerful imagery is not merely symbolic, but carries the promise of a literal and global restoration. When we look at the Beta Israel, the Bene Israel, the Pashtuns, the Igbo, and the Lemba, we see echoes of this prophecy already resonating in our days. These groups are more than historical curiosities. They are living reminders that God's promises remain intact, even through centuries of dispersion and forgetting. What makes these stories even more impactful is how they connect the past to the present and potentially to the prophetic future. The dispersion of the tribes, initially seen as an act of judgment, begins to reveal itself as part of a greater plan. It is as if God planted seeds in different parts of the world, seeds that carry the memory of his covenant and the promise of a triumphant return. These seeds are now beginning to sprout as groups claiming Israelite descent emerge from every corner of the earth, bringing with them a new understanding of the ancient words of the prophets. However, we cannot ignore the controversies and challenges that accompany these claims. Some scholars question the historical and genetic validity of these connections, while others focus on the theological impact these discoveries may have on Judaism and Christianity. But regardless of academic debates, what cannot be denied is the strength of these traditions and the resilience of these communities. They have survived time, dispersion, and in many cases, persecution, keeping alive practices that date back to Israel's ancient roots. Whether through oral traditions, religious practices, or even modern scientific evidence, the return of these lost tribes appears to be more than a possibility. It is a movement carrying the weight of ancient prophecies. As we move forward in this journey, we cannot help but ask, what will be the next chapter of this story? What do these tribes and their paths tell us about the times we live in? With every discovery, it seems we are being guided toward a greater destiny, where the past and the present converge in a prophetic alignment pointing to the future. As we continue to explore the fate of the lost tribes of Israel, it becomes increasingly evident that the history of these communities is both a testimony of dispersion and a promise of reunion. What these stories reveal is that despite geographical distances and cultural barriers, there is an invisible thread connecting these peoples to the biblical narrative, a thread that transcends generations, surviving the challenges of time and cultural assimilation. But how is this possible? How can communities scattered across the world, often without contact with one another, share practices, beliefs, and traditions that echo a common origin in Israel? To answer this question, we need to take a closer look at the details of these communities' stories, beginning with the spiritual and cultural impact of the dispersion. When the northern tribes were captured by the Assyrians and deported to foreign lands, the conqueror's intent was clear: to erase the identity of the exiles, absorb them into other cultures, and ensure they could never again organize as a unified people. Yet what historical records and surviving traditions suggest is that even under the most adverse conditions, these communities retained unmistakable traces of their Israelite identity. Take, for example, the Beta Israel. For centuries, these Ethiopian Jews lived in relative isolation, practicing a form of Judaism that, in many ways, seemed closer to the traditions described in the Torah than to the modern practices of rabbinic Judaism. This includes strict Sabbath observance, kosher dietary laws, and the celebration of festivals like Passover and Yom Kippur. Their prayers and rituals, passed down orally from generation to generation, reveal a deep connection to the traditions of ancient Israel. Even without access to the sacred texts widely used by global Judaism, the Beta Israel preserved their faith, culture, and identity. What is even more fascinating is how their story connects to a biblical prophecy. In Isaiah 11:11, we read, "In that day the Lord will reach out his hand a second time to reclaim the surviving remnant of his people from Assyria, from Egypt, from Pathros, from Cush, from Elam, from Babylonia, from Hamath, and from the islands of the sea." The reference to Cush is widely interpreted as a mention of the region of Ethiopia, where the Beta Israel maintained their presence over the centuries. Their eventual migration to Israel, facilitated by Operations Moses and Solomon in the 20th century, is seen by many as a partial fulfillment of this prophecy. Yet, the Beta Israel are just one piece of this puzzle. Let us now journey to India, where the Bene Israel claim a similar heritage. According to their oral tradition, their ancestors survived a shipwreck on India's western coast, where they established a community that preserved fundamental Jewish practices. The prolonged isolation of this community was not a barrier to their identity. On the contrary, it seems to have acted as a shield, protecting their traditions from being forgotten. For centuries, the Bene Israel performed circumcision ceremonies, observed the Sabbath as a sacred day, and followed dietary laws that resonate with the commandments of the Torah. The case of the Bene Israel also raises intriguing questions about the geography of the lost tribes' dispersion. If they truly descended from the northern tribes, as their traditions suggest, this implies a surprising migration route, possibly connected to the diaspora caused by the Assyrian invasion. This journey was not only physical, but also spiritual, as the Bene Israel found ways to adapt their religious practices to local conditions without losing sight of their original identity. To truly grasp the impact of the dispersion, we must consider one of the most intriguing groups of all, the Pashtuns. Among the mountains of Afghanistan and Pakistan, these tribes have preserved traditions that remarkably resemble Israelite practices. They refer to themselves as Bani Israel, and their oral narratives speak of an ancestry that traces back to the northern tribes of Israel. What makes their story particularly fascinating is the extent to which these traditions have survived, even within a predominantly Islamic cultural context. The similarities between their practices and Mosaic laws are so significant that some scholars believe the Pashtuns may be one of the clearest examples of the persistence of the lost tribes. Furthermore, there is linguistic and cultural evidence that reinforces this connection. Certain Pashtun clan names, such as Lavani, seem to directly reflect the names of Israelite tribes. While research into their origins is still ongoing, the fact that these traditions have been preserved for so long is a remarkable testament to the resilience of these communities. On the African continent, the story of the lost tribes becomes even more complex. The Igbo of Nigeria, for example, claim a connection to the tribes of Gad and Zebulun, a claim supported by cultural practices that echo Jewish traditions. Circumcision on the eighth day, the observance of religious festivals, and dietary laws are integral parts of their culture. Moreover, many Igbo have reconnected with Judaism in recent years, in a movement that combines tradition and rediscovery. Finally, we come to the Lemba people, whose story may be one of the most surprising of all. They claim to be descendants of the tribe of Levi, the priestly lineage of Israel, and recent genetic studies appear to support this claim. The genetic marker associated with the Kohanim, or Jewish priests, has been found in a significant portion of the Lemba population, reinforcing the possibility that they are indeed direct descendants of the Levites. Their cultural practices, which include dietary restrictions similar to kosher laws and Sabbath observance, further strengthen this connection. These stories, when viewed together, create a fascinating mosaic. They show how the lost tribes, far from disappearing entirely, were scattered like seeds across the world, preserving aspects of their original identity in ways that defy purely human explanations. What all these communities have in common is a deep connection to God's promises, a bond that transcends the barriers of time and space. As we continue exploring the impact of Israel's lost tribes, an inevitable question arises. What does all this mean for today? Why do the stories of communities like the Beta Israel, the Bene Israel, the Pashtuns, the Igbo, and the Lemba continue to captivate, and remain so relevant? The answer lies deeply rooted in biblical prophecies and the central role these tribes play in the narrative of the end times. The dispersion of the tribes was not merely a historical tragedy. It was a strategic piece of God's divine plan, designed to fulfill ancient promises and prepare the world for events yet to come. To understand the relevance of these stories in a modern context, we must turn to Scripture. Ezekiel 37 presents us with one of the Bible's most powerful and symbolic visions, the Valley of Dry Bones. In this vision, the prophet sees a field full of scattered, dry, seemingly lifeless bones. God commands Ezekiel to prophesy over the bones, and as he obeys, the bones begin to come together, forming complete skeletons. With the breath of God's Spirit, these bones come to life, rising as a vast army. God explains that these bones represent the whole house of Israel, promising to bring them back from the nations and reunite them in their land. This vision is more than a metaphor of hope. It is a prophetic declaration of what is to come, the gathering of the dispersed tribes and the restoration of Israel as a unified nation. For the lost tribes who were scattered for centuries in foreign lands, the promise is clear. They were not forgotten. Even in the most adverse conditions, God upheld his covenant and ensured that one day they would be reunited. But this reunion is not just a historical or political event. It is deeply spiritual, pointing to the fulfillment of God's divine plan in the end times. In Isaiah 11, verse 12, we read that God will raise a banner for the nations and gather the exiles of Israel. He will assemble the scattered people of Judah from the four corners of the earth. This powerful imagery suggests a global movement in which God, in his sovereignty, will bring his people back to fulfill a greater purpose. Remarkably, some of these promises have already begun to be fulfilled, as seen in the stories of groups like the Beta Israel and the Bene Israel returning to Israel. And there is more. In Jeremiah 31, God declares, "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will plant the house of Israel and the house of Judah with the seed of people and animals, just as I watched over them to uproot and tear down, to overthrow, destroy, and bring disaster, so I will watch over them to build and to plant, declares the Lord." This promise highlights that even in dispersion, God watched over his people, ensuring their spiritual roots remained intact. Now, as we see these communities emerge and claim their heritage, it becomes clear that these seeds are beginning to sprout. The reemergence of the lost tribes also carries significant implications for contemporary Judaism and Christianity. In Judaism, the gathering of the tribes is seen as a crucial step in the messianic redemption process. In Christianity, this reunion is often interpreted as a sign of the end times, indicating that the prophetic events described in Revelation are drawing closer. For instance, in Revelation 7, we read about the 144,000 sealed, 12,000 from each of Israel's tribes, who play a central role in the final events of human history. This reaffirms that even the tribes considered lost still have an essential role to play in God's plan. Meanwhile, the claims of modern communities identifying as descendants of the lost tribes continue to raise intriguing questions. Are these communities the legitimate descendants of the original tribes? Or have they, in their search for identity and purpose, spiritually connected themselves with Israel's promises? Either way, their stories and traditions profoundly impact both scholars and believers because they force us to confront the living reality of God's promises. Take the example of the Igbo of Nigeria. Despite centuries of dispersion and isolation, they have maintained traditions that echo Israelite practices, such as circumcision on the 8th day and the observance of dietary laws. In recent years, many members of the Igbo community have sought a formal reconnection with Judaism, celebrating their roots and reaffirming their identity. For them, this search is not merely cultural but deeply spiritual, a calling that resonates with the prophecies of return and restoration. There are also the Pashtuns, whose connection to the lost tribes defies simple explanations. Their insistence on an Israelite identity, passed down through generations via oral traditions, is a testament to how spiritual roots can withstand the forces of cultural assimilation. These stories, when viewed together, reveal a surprising continuity between the ancient and the modern, between promise and fulfillment. As more evidence emerges, whether through oral traditions, cultural practices, or even scientific advancements like DNA testing, it becomes increasingly clear that the dispersion of the tribes was not the end of the story. On the contrary, it was the beginning of a new and mysterious chapter, one that is now unfolding before our eyes. This journey, which began with the dispersion by the Assyrian Empire, is converging toward a destiny prophesied thousands of years ago, the gathering of the tribes under the leadership of the Messiah in a time of redemption and restoration. With each step in this journey, we realize that we are moving towards something greater, something that transcends the boundaries of time and space. These tribes, once thought to be lost, are beginning to reappear, not just as individuals or communities, but as part of a much larger divine plan. And as we continue to explore their stories, we see that they are more than historical accounts or cultural traditions. They are living reminders that God's promises are eternal, that He never abandons His people, and that the future He promised is closer than we might imagine. As we continue unraveling the history of Israel's lost tribes, it's impossible to ignore the spiritual and prophetic dimensions surrounding this narrative. It's not merely a quest for ancestry or historical curiosity. It's a story intertwined with God's promises, with echoes reverberating from ancient times to the present day, pointing to a future full of meaning and purpose. At the heart of this narrative is the promise of restoration. The dispersion of the tribes, as we've seen, was not merely the result of rebellion or disobedience by the people of Israel. It was also an essential part of a greater divine plan, designed to scatter seeds of faith across the world. These seeds, now sprouting in places as distant as Ethiopia, India, West Africa, and Southeast Asia, are living proof that God's promises never fail. And this restoration is not something to be observed from afar. It is deeply personal. When we look at the stories of the Beta Israel, the Bene Israel, the Pashtuns, the Igbo, and the Lemba, we see communities that kept ancient traditions alive against all odds. But we see something even deeper, a spiritual connection that sustained them even when they were isolated from the rest of the Jewish people. This connection is a powerful reminder that God not only allows His people to be scattered, He accompanies them in their dispersion, ensuring they are never completely lost. For the Beta Israel, for instance, the story of dispersion is both painful and hopeful. For centuries, they were marginalized in their homeland, seen as outsiders despite their deep connection to Jewish traditions. Yet, even amidst oppression, they maintained their practices, prayers, and identity. When they were finally brought to Israel through operations like Operation Moses and Operation Solomon, many Beta Israel saw it as the fulfillment of prophecy. For them, the journey was not merely physical, but spiritual, a return to their roots, and a sign that God was still at work in their lives. But what about the Bene Israel? Their story challenges us to reconsider what it means to belong to God's people. Isolated for centuries in India, they lost contact with other Jewish communities and, in some cases, adapted their practices to align with local culture. Yet, when they were eventually rediscovered, their connection to Israelite traditions was undeniable. This raises a fundamental question. What truly defines the identity of a lost tribe? Is it merely the preservation of customs and traditions? Or is there something deeper, a spiritual calling that transcends history and geography? The same question applies to the Pashtuns, whose connection to Israel's tribes is both fascinating and enigmatic. Even while living in a predominantly Islamic society, they preserve traditions that mirror Mosaic laws, from circumcision on the eighth day to dietary rules that forbid pork. Their oral narratives, passed down through generations, speak of an Israelite ancestry, and their clans carry names reminiscent of the lost tribes. For the Pashtuns, an Israelite identity is not just a matter of history, it is an intrinsic part of who they are. The same can be said of the Igbo of Nigeria. Despite living separated from larger Jewish communities for centuries, the Igbo preserve traditions that closely resemble Israelite practices. For many of them, the rediscovery of these roots has been a call to reconnect with the faith of their ancestors. In recent years, a growing number of Igbo have formally embraced Judaism, seeing it as a step toward the restoration of their original identity. It is a movement that, for many, resonates with the promises of return found in Scripture. And finally, there are the Lemba, whose story may be one of the most intriguing of all. When DNA testing revealed that many Lemba carry the Kohanim haplotype, the priestly lineage of Aaron, the world began to take greater notice of their claim to be descendants of the tribe of Levi. Their connection to Israelite traditions goes beyond cultural practices. It is literally encoded in their genetic makeup. For the Lemba, this discovery was not only a validation of their beliefs, but also a powerful reminder that their roots have not been forgotten. What all these stories have in common is the idea that the dispersion of the tribes was, in a way, an act of planting. Just as a farmer scatters seeds across different parts of a field, God scattered his people throughout the world, ensuring that his presence would be felt even in the most remote places. And now, as these tribes begin to emerge, we realize we are living in a pivotal moment in history. Prophecies that once seemed distant and abstract are becoming reality before our eyes. Isaiah 49:6 reminds us that Israel was not called only to be restored as a nation, but to be a light to the nations. As the lost tribes are gathered, this mission becomes even clearer. The gathering of these tribes is not just about restoring a national identity, it is about fulfilling a spiritual purpose that benefits all humanity. The return of the tribes is a sign that God's plan is unfolding and that he still has a purpose for Israel and for the world. However, this return is not without challenges. Some of these communities face skepticism both within and outside the Jewish world. Their claims are often contested, and many encounter obstacles in their efforts to reconnect with Israel. But, as we have seen throughout this narrative, the journey of the lost tribes has never been easy. Since the days of the Assyrian captivity, these communities have faced seemingly insurmountable challenges, yet they have always endured. This endurance is a testament to God's faithfulness and his promise that none of his children will be forgotten. As more communities emerge with similar claims, we are challenged to expand our understanding of what it means to be part of Israel. Perhaps what truly defines a lost tribe is not just its historical or cultural connection, but its willingness to respond to God's call when he beckons them home. And for the rest of the world, these stories serve as living reminders that God's promises are eternal, that he never abandons his people, and that the plan he began is nearing its fulfillment. As God's promises for the gathering of the lost tribes unfold, we see that the convergence of these events transcends any previous historical period. Each community that claims descent from the tribes of Israel is not merely a piece of a puzzle, but a reflection of divine faithfulness throughout time. Yet the return of these tribes is not merely about reuniting lost genealogies. It is an act of spiritual reconciliation and prophetic fulfillment that points to the climax of the story of redemption. Scripture makes it clear that the restoration of the lost tribes is a central event in the timeline of the end times. Ezekiel 37 not only promises the gathering of the exiles, but emphasizes unity under a single king, the Messiah. My servant David will be king over them, and they will all have one shepherd. They will live in the land I gave to my servant Jacob, the land where your ancestors lived. They and their children and their children's children will live there forever, and David, my servant, will be their prince forever. Ezekiel 37, 24 to 25. This vision is not just about physical return, but about the restoration of a spiritual relationship with God, where all previous divisions will be overcome. The return of the lost tribes is also intertwined with the idea of global redemption. The dispersion of the tribes was not merely an act of judgment, it was an act of providence that allowed God's message to spread beyond the borders of Israel. Through the generations, the seeds of the covenant were planted in distant lands, and as these tribes are gathered, we see the first fruits of a much greater divine plan. In Isaiah 64, we find the promise, "Lift up your eyes and look around. All assemble and come to you. Your sons come from afar, and your daughters are carried on the hip." This powerful image reminds us that the return of the tribes is not an isolated event, but a global movement that encompasses all nations. The echoes of this promise are evident in the stories of the communities we are exploring. Consider the Beta Israel. For centuries, they kept alive the tradition that they were part of the chosen people, even while isolated from the rest of Judaism. Their journey back to Israel was not just a geographic return, but a reaffirmation of their spiritual identity. For them, the fulfillment of prophecy is tangible, lived in every step they took toward their ancestral homeland. Similarly, the Bene Israel of India see their history as a testament to God's faithfulness. Isolated for generations, they preserved practices that mirrored the Torah, even when disconnected from other Jewish communities. When they were finally recognized and given the opportunity to return to Israel, it was as if a forgotten promise had been fulfilled. For the Bene Israel, this return was not merely a matter of cultural identity, but a restoration of their place in God's divine plan. And what about the Pashtuns? Although most of them practice Islam, their traditions and oral narratives point to a connection with Israel's lost tribes. Many Pashtuns believe they are descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh, and their insistence on preserving practices resembling Mosaic laws is evidence that their spiritual identity has remained intact through the generations. For some, the recognition of these connections is a reminder that God never forgets his children, even when they are scattered to the farthest corners of the world. The impact of these narratives goes beyond the communities themselves. They challenge us to reconsider Israel's role in God's global plan. As we saw in Isaiah 49:6, Israel was called to be a light to the nations. As the lost tribes emerge and begin to reunite, this light becomes even more visible, illuminating God's purpose not just for Israel, but for all humanity. This reunion is not merely a prophetic event, it is an invitation for all people to participate in God's plan of redemption. The Lemba, whose genetic connection to Israel's priesthood was confirmed through modern testing, provide another example of how science and faith can converge to reveal God's purpose. Their cultural practices, including Sabbath observance and kosher dietary laws, reinforce the idea that their identity as descendants of the tribe of Levi was never completely lost. For the Lemba, their story is more than a curiosity. It is a confirmation that they have a role to play in the greater narrative of Israel. These stories also have profound implications for the future. In Revelation 7, we see a vision of 144,000 sealed, 12,000 from each tribe of Israel. This number, while symbolic, points to the fact that the lost tribes still have a crucial role in the events of the end times. They are not just a memory of the past. They are an integral part of the future God is preparing. The return of these tribes, both physical and spiritual, is a sign that God's plan is moving toward its climax. However, the gathering of the lost tribes is not a simple or linear process. It involves challenges, both internal and external. Some of these communities face skepticism and rejection, while others struggle to adapt to the modern context. But as we have learned throughout this journey, the history of the lost tribes has never been marked by ease. Since the days of the Assyrian captivity, these communities have faced persecution, exile, and seemingly insurmountable obstacles. And yet, they have persisted. This resilience is a testament to God's faithfulness and the strength of his promise. What these stories teach us above all is that God's faithfulness knows no bounds. He remains with his people even when they are scattered. He fulfills his promises even when they seem impossible. And he uses the story of the lost tribes to remind us that his plan is greater than we can imagine. As we continue exploring this narrative, we realize that we are not just looking into the past, but also glimpsing the future. A future where all of God's promises will be fulfilled, and all the tribes of Israel will be reunited under the leadership of the Messiah in a kingdom of peace and justice that will last forever. As we near the end of this journey, what once seemed like a collection of scattered stories begins to take shape as part of a unified divine plan. The dispersion of the lost tribes, far from being an event of forgetting or defeat, reveals itself as a testimony to God's sovereignty. Every fragment of these tribes' histories points to a greater truth. They were never forgotten, and their return is a crucial milestone in the narrative that links the beginning of time to its end. The promise that God will reunite all the tribes of Israel is a powerful reminder that he never abandons his people. Even when all seems lost, when the distances are vast and centuries pass by, his faithfulness remains. He is the God who transforms chaos into order, who brings life to dry bones, and who gathers those who have been scattered to the ends of the earth. The restoration of the tribes is more than a historical event. It is a declaration that God's plan for humanity is unchanging and inevitable. Yet there is something deeply personal in this story. It is not just about tribes or nations. It is about individuals, families, and communities who carried their traditions through generations, often without knowing they were part of a greater prophecy. It is about the Beta Israel, who saw their journey to Israel as an echo of the Exodus. It is about the Bene Israel, who kept the Sabbath and circumcision alive in a distant land as a reminder of their covenant with God. It is about the Pashtuns, the Igbo, the Lemba, and so many others who, even in isolation, preserved fragments of an identity that now resurfaces with renewed strength. These stories are not just to be admired, they are an invitation for all of us to recognize that we are part of something greater, that we are pieces of a divine puzzle. The return of the lost tribes is not just a matter of genealogy or history, it is a vision of what is to come. It is a reminder that God is gathering his people to fulfill promises that transcend time. It is a call for us to reflect on our own place in this greater narrative and to seek our connection with the Creator. So what does this return mean in the context of today's world? It means that we are living in a unique time when history, science, and faith converge to confirm what the prophets proclaimed thousands of years ago. Groups like the Beta Israel, Bene Israel, and Lemba, with their rediscovery and return, are the first signs of something much greater. They remind us that the story is not over and that the final chapters are being written before our eyes. As the lost tribes continue to emerge, the question remains, what does this mean for you? These stories are a call to see beyond what is visible, to recognize that God's plan is not just for the tribes of Israel, but for all humanity. He is calling each of us to be part of the restoration, to be living witnesses of his fulfilled promises. And as we do this, we become part of something much greater than ourselves. A story that began in the Garden of Eden, crossed the desert with Moses, was foretold by the prophets, and will culminate in the coming of the Messiah and the final restoration of all things. If you felt the impact of these stories, if you were moved by the depth of the connections spanning centuries, then this is just the beginning of your journey. Here at The Eternal Compass, our goal is to explore these ancient truths, connect them to the present, and discover how they shape our future. There is so much more to uncover, so many mysteries waiting to be revealed, and we want you to be part of it. So, if this journey has inspired you, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you are not only helping us continue exploring these mysteries, but also joining a community that seeks answers, values knowledge, and understands that the story of Israel is, in fact, the story of all of us. Leave a comment, share this video, and above all, stay curious, because, as we have just discovered, the answers are out there waiting to be found, and together we can uncover them.